Margaret Chin stood at the graveside, her black dress whipping in the autumn wind as she watched her husband of 32 years being lowered into the earth. Robert had been her anchor, her best friend, and now he was gone, taken by a sudden heart attack at 68. The service had been beautiful, filled with colleagues from his accounting firm and neighbors who remembered his gentle smile and generous spirit. But as the last mourner departed, Margaret noticed the cold stares from Robert's family, his sister Patricia, his brother Marcus, and their children, who had barely acknowledged her presence throughout the ceremony. She had always known Robert's siblings resented their marriage. When a successful Chinese-American doctor married their brother, a quiet accountant from a working-class Irish family, they saw it as Robert marrying above his station. They whispered that Margaret was too ambitious, too focused on her career, and that she had changed their beloved brother. For 3 decades, Robert had tried to bridge the gap between his wife and his family, hosting holiday dinners that grew increasingly tense and mediating arguments that seemed to multiply with each passing year. Now, as Margaret stood alone by the fresh grave, Patricia approached with an expression that mixed grief with something harder. "We need to talk," she said curtly. "About the house, about Robert's things. We know he would have wanted everything to stay in the family, the real family." Margaret's stomach lurched. She had been so consumed with grief that she hadn't even thought about practical matters like wills or inheritances. Robert had always handled their finances, and in her shock and sorrow, she had simply assumed she would have time to sort everything out. The next morning brought a harsh awakening. Marcus appeared at her door with a legal document, claiming that Robert had left everything to his siblings. The house, the bank accounts, even Robert's pension. According to this will, Margaret was entitled to nothing. "You can stay until the funeral expenses are settled," Patricia announced, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But this house belongs to the Chin family now. We'll give you a week to pack your things and find somewhere else to live." Margaret stared at the document in disbelief. This couldn't be real. Robert had loved her deeply, had always spoken of their future together, their retirement plans, their dreams of traveling. How could he have left her with nothing? But as she examined the papers through her tears, everything appeared legitimate. Signatures, dates, legal seals. Her world, already shattered by loss, crumbled completely as she realized she was not just a widow, but a homeless one. The family she had tried so hard to win over had finally found their moment of triumph, and they showed no mercy in their victory. The humiliation burned worse than the grief. Margaret packed her belongings into suitcases and cardboard boxes while Patricia supervised, making sure she didn't take anything that belonged to the family. Family photos from their wedding, gifts Robert had given her over the years, even her own medical diplomas were scrutinized. Those picture frames were Robert's mother's, Patricia declared, forcing Margaret to remove their wedding photos and leave the silver frames behind. "And that jewelry box, that's been in our family for generations." Margaret wanted to fight, wanted to scream that she had been Robert's wife, that she had held his hand through his father's funeral, had nursed him through pneumonia 2 winters ago, had shared his bed and his dreams and his fears. But grief had sapped her strength, and the legal documents seemed ironclad. She had never paid attention to their estate planning, trusting Robert completely to handle such matters. Now that trust seemed to have been her downfall. With nowhere else to go, Margaret checked into a modest hotel across town, her life reduced to 3 suitcases and a broken heart. Her medical practice had been her other anchor, but even there, she found no solace. Patients asked about Robert with kind concern, not knowing that each mention of his name was like salt in an open wound. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, her red-rimmed eyes, her trembling hands during procedures. Dr. Williams, the chief of surgery, called her into his office after she nearly made a critical error during what should have been a routine operation. "Margaret, I'm worried about you," he said gently. "I know you're grieving, but I can't have a surgeon whose mind isn't fully present. Take a leave of absence. Get yourself together, and then come back when you're ready." It was delivered with kindness, but Margaret heard it as another door closing, another piece of her identity stripped away. First her home, now her career. What did she have left? The hotel room became her prison. She lay on the thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying every moment of her marriage to Robert. Had there been signs she missed? Had he really grown to resent her success, her strong personality, her ambition? The Robert she thought she knew would never have left her destitute, would never have chosen his siblings over his wife. But perhaps she had never really known him at all. Perhaps 32 years of marriage had been built on an illusion, and now she was finally seeing the truth of who Robert Chin really was. Margaret's salvation came from an unexpected source, Robert's former secretary, Helen Morrison, who had worked with him for over 15 years. Helen appeared at the hotel one evening, her face flushed with anger and clutching a manila envelope. "Dr. Chun," she said breathlessly, "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you. What they're doing isn't right. Robert never wrote that will." Helen explained that she had been present when Robert updated his will just 6 months earlier. "He was very specific," she said, pulling documents from the envelope. "He wanted to make sure you were taken care of, especially after his retirement. He talked about how hard you'd worked, how much you'd sacrificed to support his family over the years. He said his siblings had never appreciated either of you, and he wasn't going to let them benefit from your success." The real will was dramatically different from what Patricia and Marcus had presented. Robert had indeed left the family home to Margaret, along with their joint bank accounts, his pension, and a life insurance policy worth over $200,000. But more shocking was what Helen revealed about Robert's secret business dealings. "Your husband wasn't just an accountant," she said quietly. "He was also an investor, and a very good one. He'd been quietly building a portfolio for years, using his accounting knowledge to identify undervalued companies." Margaret stared at the investment statements Helen handed her. The numbers seemed impossible: stocks, bonds, real estate investments, even a small stake in a tech startup that had gone public the previous year. The total value was staggering, over $8 million that she had never known existed. Robert had been methodical, patient, building their future security while never mentioning it to her. "He wanted to surprise you for your retirement," Helen explained. "He said you'd worked so hard as a doctor, supporting both your careers, that he wanted to make sure you could retire in style." The forged will became clear in retrospect. Patricia and Marcus must have known about Robert's investment somehow, perhaps through family conversations or overheard phone calls. They had fabricated documents, forged signatures, and constructed an elaborate lie to steal not just Margaret's modest inheritance, but millions of dollars they believed belonged to them by blood. Their plan had been nearly perfect, except they hadn't counted on Helen's loyalty and her intimate knowledge of Robert's true wishes. Armed with the real will and Helen's testimony, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death: hope. But she also felt a burning anger that gave her strength. Robert's siblings hadn't just stolen her inheritance, they had tried to rob her of her husband's love and respect, making her believe he had abandoned her in death. Now she understood the truth. Robert had loved her deeply enough to spend years secretly building their future together, and she would honor that love by fighting for what was rightfully hers. Margaret's first call was to James Patterson, the city's most respected estate attorney, whose reputation for aggressive litigation preceded him. Patterson listened intently as she laid out the evidence Helen had provided, his experienced eyes scanning the documents with growing interest. "This is one of the most audacious cases of will forgery I've seen in 30 years of practice," he said finally. "The good news is, we have compelling evidence. The bad news is, they've had possession of the estate for weeks now, and unwinding this mess won't be simple." The legal machinery moved slowly at first. Patricia and Marcus had already begun liquidating assets, selling Robert's car and some of his personal effects. They had even started renovations on the house, ripping out the kitchen Margaret had designed and replacing it with what Patricia called something more traditional. Each day that passed felt like another violation, another piece of Robert being erased and replaced with his siblings' vision of what his life should have been. Patterson filed an emergency injunction to stop any further asset transfers, but the damage was already significant. "They're not stupid," he explained to Margaret during one of their strategy sessions. "They know that every dollar they spend makes it harder for us to recover the full estate. They're gambling that even if we win, the legal costs and complications will reduce what you ultimately receive. The cynical calculation of it all made Margaret's stomach turn. These people were willing to destroy Robert's memory and her future for money they had never earned. The depositions began 3 months after Robert's funeral. Margaret sat in a sterile conference room, watching Patricia lie under oath with remarkable composure. Robert always resented his wife's success, Patricia testified, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. He felt emasculated by her career, her income, her status. In recent years, he'd grown closer to his birth family, the people who really understood him. Marcus corroborated every detail, painting a picture of a marriage in decline and a man who had finally chosen blood over what they called an inappropriate alliance. But Patterson was thorough in his preparation. He had tracked down the forger, a disbarred lawyer Patricia had found through her ex-husband's criminal contacts. Under pressure and facing felony charges, the man confessed to creating the false documents for $20,000. He provided detailed testimony about how Patricia had brought him samples of Robert's signature and detailed instructions about how to structure the fake will to make it appear legitimate. Helen's testimony was devastating to the siblings' case. She produced phone records showing Robert had called Patterson's office multiple times to discuss estate planning. She had copies of emails where Robert discussed his investment strategies and his hopes for Margaret's future. Most damaging of all, she had secretly recorded a conversation where Patricia and Marcus discussed their plan to contest Robert's real will before they even knew what it contained. "We deserve that money more than she does," Patricia's voice echoed in the courtroom. She never fit into this family, anyway. As the legal battle intensified, Margaret began to understand the true scope of what Robert had built. Working with a forensic accountant Patterson recommended, she discovered that her husband's investment acumen went far beyond what even Helen had known. Robert had been operating under multiple business entities, carefully structuring his investments to minimize tax liability while maximizing growth. He had holdings in real estate across 3 states, a diversified stock portfolio that had weathered multiple market downturns, and even a small venture capital fund that had backed several successful startups. The most surprising discovery was Robert's involvement in cryptocurrency investments. Long before Bitcoin became mainstream, he had quietly accumulated digital assets that were now worth over $3 million alone. Margaret found detailed notes in his handwriting, explaining blockchain technology and his rationale for each investment. For Margaret's future, he had written at the top of one analysis, "She gave up so much to support my family over the years. This is my way of giving back." Each revelation made Patricia and Marcus's betrayal sting more deeply, but it also strengthened Margaret's resolve. Her husband hadn't just been planning their retirement. He had been building a legacy that would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life and even establish charitable foundations in areas they both cared about. Medical research, education scholarships for underprivileged students, support for immigrants pursuing professional careers, all dreams they had discussed but never had the resources to pursue. The forensic investigation also revealed how Robert's siblings had discovered the extent of his wealth. Marcus's son, Danny, worked in IT and had apparently hacked into Robert's email accounts after his death, discovering correspondence with investment advisors and account statements. This digital evidence proved premeditation. They hadn't stumbled upon the fortune accidentally, but had systematically invaded Robert's privacy to identify assets they could claim. Most infuriating was evidence that Patricia had been planning this betrayal for over a year. Margaret's investigator found social media posts where Patricia complained about her brother's selfish wife and made veiled references to ensuring Robert's money stayed where it belonged. There were text messages between the siblings discussing Margaret's vulnerability and their strategy for isolating her immediately after Robert's death, before she could get organized or seek legal counsel. The cryptocurrency holdings presented a particular challenge. Robert had stored his digital wallet keys in a safety deposit box that only Margaret could access as a spouse. Patricia and Marcus had been frantically trying to locate these assets, even hiring their own investigator to track down Robert's cryptocurrency investments. Their lawyer argued that since they hadn't known about these assets when they forged the will, they shouldn't be considered part of the fraud. Patterson countered that ignorance of the full scope of their theft didn't diminish their criminal intent or legal liability. As the evidence mounted against them, Patricia and Marcus grew increasingly desperate. They hired a more aggressive attorney, one known for character assassination and procedural delays rather than ethical practice. Their new strategy was to paint Margaret as a gold-digging outsider who had manipulated Robert throughout their marriage, arguing that even if the will was forged, she didn't deserve the inheritance because she had never been a legitimate member of the family. The attacks became deeply personal and racially charged. They claimed Margaret had isolated Robert from his Irish Catholic roots, forcing him to abandon family traditions and embrace her Chinese heritage. They produced witnesses who testified that Robert seemed different after his marriage, less connected to his siblings and childhood friends. Their lawyer argued that Robert's investment success was actually Margaret's doing, that she had used her medical income and professional connections to generate returns, making the fortune community property rather than Robert's individual achievement. Margaret sat in court day after day, listening to her 32-year marriage being dissected and distorted. Former neighbors testified that they had seemed mismatched, that Robert appeared uncomfortable at Margaret's medical functions, that she had pushed him to move to a more expensive neighborhood where he didn't fit in. Every happy memory was reframed as evidence of manipulation, every gesture of love recast as calculation. The most painful moment came when Patricia took the stand and claimed that Robert had confided his regrets about his marriage during his final months. "He told me he felt like he'd lost himself," she testified, looking directly at Margaret with cold satisfaction. "He said he'd spent 30 years trying to be someone he wasn't, trying to live up to her expectations. He wanted to come home to his real family, the people who accepted him as he was." But Patterson had prepared for this line of attack. He produced Robert's medical records, showing regular checkups where Robert had consistently listed Margaret as his emergency contact and had spoken glowingly to his doctors about their marriage. He had phone records showing Robert called Margaret multiple times daily when they were apart, even brief separations for medical conferences or family visits. Most convincingly, he had Robert's own words, emails to friends describing his pride in Margaret's career and his excitement about their retirement plans. The cryptocurrency evidence proved particularly damaging to the siblings' credibility. Patterson demonstrated that Robert's digital investments had been made over several years, with detailed research notes showing his personal interest in the technology. This wasn't someone being manipulated by his wife, Patterson argued in court. This was a sophisticated investor following his own curiosity and making independent decisions about cutting-edge financial instruments. Dr. Chen didn't even know these investments existed until after her husband's death. The judge grew visibly frustrated with the siblings' changing stories and increasingly desperate accusations. When their lawyer tried to introduce evidence that Margaret had been having an affair, a claim based on nothing more than her friendship with a male colleague, the judge warned about sanctions for frivolous arguments. It was becoming clear that Patricia and Marcus had overplayed their hand, allowing their hatred of Margaret to cloud their legal judgment. The months of legal battle had transformed Margaret in ways she never expected. The grief remained, but it was now accompanied by a fierce determination that Robert would have recognized. She had always been strong in her medical practice, making life and death decisions with calm precision, but this was different. This was personal, and it required a kind of strength she was still discovering she possessed. She returned to work part-time, finding that the focus required for surgery actually helped her cope with the stress of the court proceedings. Her colleagues rallied around her, with several offering to testify about Robert's obvious devotion to her and his pride in their marriage. Dr. Williams, who had initially suggested her leave of absence, now praised her resilience and determination. "I've seen how you handle pressure in the operating room," he told her. "But this is something else entirely. You're inspiring all of us." Margaret also began to understand Robert's investments for the first time, working with financial advisors to grasp the scope of what he had built. She discovered that he had been incredibly strategic, balancing conservative investments with calculated risks that had paid off handsomely. More importantly, she found notes and documents that revealed his thinking, not just about money, but about their future together and his hopes for her after his death. One particularly moving discovery was a letter Robert had written but never sent, dated just 3 months before his death. "My dearest Margaret," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably overwhelmed by all the financial details I never shared with you. I'm sorry for keeping so much secret. I wanted to surprise you, to show you how much your sacrifices for my family meant to me. You gave up so much to support my siblings and parents over the years, never complaining when we spent our vacations visiting them. Instead of traveling like you wanted, this money is my way of saying thank you and ensuring you never have to worry about anything again." The letter continued with detailed explanations of his investment philosophy and specific instructions for managing the various accounts and holdings. But more than the practical information, it contained Robert's deep love and appreciation for everything Margaret had done during their marriage. He acknowledged the difficulties with his family, admitted that he should have defended her more strongly over the years, and expressed his hope that his financial planning would give her the freedom to live exactly as she chose in her later years. Reading Robert's words gave Margaret a new perspective on the courtroom attacks. Patricia and Marcus were trying to rewrite history, but Robert had left a clear record of his true feelings. Every investment, every financial decision, had been made with Margaret's future in mind. He had loved her completely, and his careful planning was proof of that love. Their attempts to portray her as an outsider or manipulator only revealed their own inability to understand the depth of Robert's feelings for his wife. As the trial continued, Margaret began to see herself through Robert's eyes, not as the outsider his family claimed, but as the strong, accomplished woman he had chosen to spend his life with. She had supported his family financially and emotionally for decades, never asking for recognition or gratitude. She had built a successful medical practice while also being a devoted wife. She deserved Robert's inheritance not just because of legal documents, but because she had earned it through 3 decades of love and partnership. The trial's turning point came when Patterson called Robert's longtime friend and colleague, Michael Torres, who had worked at the same accounting firm for over 20 years. Michael testified that Robert had discussed his will revision in detail, specifically mentioning his frustration with his siblings' treatment of Margaret. He said he was tired of watching his family disrespect his wife, Michael recalled. "Robert told me that Patricia and Marcus had borrowed money from him multiple times over the years, but had never thanked Margaret for agreeing to those loans from their joint accounts." Michael's testimony revealed a pattern of financial exploitation that Margaret had never fully recognized. Over the years, Robert had lent his siblings money for various emergencies, Marcus's failed business ventures, Patricia's divorce proceedings, their children's college expenses, always presenting these loans to Margaret as temporary arrangements that were rarely, if ever, repaid. Robert calculated that he had lent them over $150,000 over the years, Michael testified. He said it was money that came from Margaret's income as much as his, but they acted like he was giving them his own money. The prosecution then introduced evidence that Patricia and Marcus had been pressuring Robert for more money in the months before his death. Patricia had been facing foreclosure on her house, and Marcus's latest business venture was failing. They had asked Robert for significant loans, amounts that would have required liquidating some of his investment holdings. Robert had been reluctant, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he was finally setting boundaries with his siblings' financial demands. Helen Morrison returned to the stand with additional evidence she had remembered. She produced calendar entries showing multiple meetings between Robert and his attorney in his final months, specifically to revise his estate planning. Mr. Chin was very clear about his intentions, she testified. He said his siblings had taken advantage of his generosity and Margaret's kindness for too long. He wanted to ensure that his wife would be financially secure and that his siblings would finally have to become financially independent. The most damaging testimony came from the forger himself, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described in detail how Patricia had approached him, explaining that she deserved her brother's money more than the Chinese woman who never fit in. He had been paid not just for forging the will, but for creating backdated documents that would make the forgery appear legitimate. Patricia had provided him with detailed financial information about Robert's holdings, proving she had known about at least some of the investments before his death. The defense's case crumbled completely when Patterson produced phone records showing calls between Patricia and Marcus immediately after Robert's funeral, discussing how quickly they needed to move to secure the estate. The conversations revealed their knowledge of Robert's investment accounts and their plan to liquidate assets before Margaret could mount a legal challenge. "We need to move fast," Patricia's voice was heard saying on the recording. "If she figures out what Robert was really worth, she'll fight us." Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. During closing arguments, he interrupted the defense attorney's character attacks on Margaret to point out that regardless of anyone's opinion about the marriage, the evidence of will forgery was overwhelming. "This case isn't about whether anyone approves of the deceased's choice of spouse," he stated firmly. "It's about fraud, forgery, and theft. The evidence is clear and compelling." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a unanimous verdict in Margaret's favor. They found that the will presented by Robert's siblings was fraudulent, that the real will clearly established Margaret as the primary beneficiary, and that Patricia and Marcus had engaged in criminal conspiracy to defraud the estate. The judge ordered immediate restoration of all assets to Margaret, plus damages for the legal costs and the value of assets that had been sold or damaged during the siblings' brief control of the estate. The restoration of Margaret's inheritance was swift but complex. The forensic accountants had to trace every transaction, every sale, every alteration made during the months when Patricia and Marcus controlled Robert's estate. Some assets had been sold below market value in their haste to liquidate, requiring the siblings to compensate Margaret for the difference. The house renovations they had undertaken had to be reversed, with Patricia and Marcus bearing the cost of restoring the kitchen and other rooms to their original condition. The cryptocurrency holdings proved to be the most valuable part of the estate. Robert's early investments in Bitcoin and Ethereum had appreciated dramatically, and his careful diversification into other digital assets had created a portfolio worth over $4 million by the time of the settlement. Margaret found detailed notes Robert had left about his cryptocurrency strategy, including predictions about future growth that were proving remarkably accurate even after his death. But the financial restoration was only part of Margaret's vindication. The court also ordered Patricia and Marcus to pay punitive damages for the emotional distress they had caused, recognizing that their actions went beyond simple theft to include deliberate cruelty designed to make Margaret believe her husband had abandoned her. The judge's written opinion was scathing, describing their behavior as a calculated campaign of psychological warfare against a grieving widow. The criminal charges were equally significant. Patricia and Marcus were convicted of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, receiving sentences that included both jail time and substantial fines. Their children, who had been aware of the scheme, faced their own legal consequences. The family that had tried to destroy Margaret's life was now fractured by their own greed and hatred. Margaret moved back into her home, but everything was different now. She understood Robert's love in a way she never had before, seeing evidence of his care and planning in every investment statement and financial document. The house felt like a shrine to their marriage, but also like a foundation for her future. With her financial security assured, she could make choices based on passion rather than necessity. She established the Robert Chin Foundation, using a portion of the inheritance to fund scholarships for immigrant students pursuing careers in accounting and finance. She also created a medical research fund focused on sudden cardiac death, hoping to prevent other families from experiencing the sudden loss that had devastated her life. These charitable endeavors felt like a way to honor Robert's memory while also using his careful financial planning to benefit others. The ordeal had also taught Margaret about her own strength and capabilities. She had navigated complex legal proceedings, mastered investment concepts she had never needed to understand, and fought successfully against people who had tried to destroy her. The shy young woman who had once worried about fitting into Robert's family was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth and was prepared to defend it. 5 years after the trial, Margaret's life had taken shapes that neither she nor Robert could have imagined. The foundation bearing his name had distributed over $2 million in scholarships and research grants, creating a legacy that honored both his financial acumen and their shared values. Margaret had become a prominent philanthropist in the city, using her medical expertise and newfound financial resources to support causes they both cared about. She had also returned to surgery, but on her own terms. With financial independence assured, she could choose her cases based on medical interest and patient need rather than financial pressure. She established a free clinic for uninsured patients, staffing it with young doctors who shared her commitment to accessible healthcare. The clinic became a model for other cities, proving that sustainable healthcare for the poor was possible with proper funding and organization. The house had been restored to exactly the way Robert had left it, but Margaret had also added touches that reflected her own growth and independence. Robert's study, where she had discovered so many of his investment records, became her foundation office. The kitchen, once torn apart by Patricia's renovations, was rebuilt according to Margaret's original design but with upgrades that reflected her new understanding of their finances. They had been wealthier than she ever realized, but Robert's frugal habits had masked their prosperity. She had never remarried, feeling that her partnership with Robert had been complete and irreplaceable. But she had built new friendships and found new purposes that filled her life with meaning. The trauma of the legal battle had faded, leaving behind a clearer understanding of Robert's love and her own capabilities. She was no longer the grieving widow who had been cast out by her husband's family, but a confident woman who had fought for truth and won. The siblings' lives had taken very different trajectories. Patricia had served 18 months in minimum security prison and emerged to find her house foreclosed and her relationships with her children strained by the scandal. Marcus had lost his accounting license and worked now as a bookkeeper for a small business, his entrepreneurial dreams permanently damaged by the criminal conviction. Their children had suffered social embarrassment and professional consequences, learning too late that their parents' hatred had poisoned their own futures. Margaret felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only sadness that Robert's death had revealed such ugliness in people he had loved. But she also felt profound gratitude for the truth that had ultimately prevailed. Robert's love had been real, his planning had been meticulous, and his trust in her strength had been justified. The fortune he had built became the foundation for a life of purpose and generosity that honored both his memory and her own potential. Standing in their garden on what would have been Robert's 73rd birthday, Margaret reflected on the journey from betrayal to vindication. The fortune her husband had secretly built had given her not just financial security, but the freedom to become the person she was meant to be: strong, independent, generous, and unafraid. Robert's greatest gift hadn't been the money itself, but the proof of love that it represented and the strength she had discovered in defending that love. In the end, the siblings who had tried to cast her out had only succeeded in revealing the depth of Robert's devotion and the power of Margaret's own resilience.